very much, Professor. Can I start by thanking you not only for the leadership you've given to the organisation, the centre, the library over the last several years, but also 40 years of service to the University of Australia, and I wish you and your family well in the future. Can I join in thanking Andrew Blythe and of course Tom Frame for the guidance and stewardship they've given, particularly to this series of retrospectives. I have a few random comments to make. Can I say that one of the reasons why I would argue that I led a reasonably successful government was that I had a very talented group of men and women in it, and they brought a lot of passion to it. I think we saw some of the passion on display just a moment ago with Mal Brough in an area that has frankly bedevilled governments of both persuasions and people of goodwill in both the political parties. I remember in my opposition days dealing with various ministers responsible for Indigenous affairs. I probably profoundly disagreed with some of their approaches. Others I found a bit more agreeable, but I didn't doubt that they worried about the challenge. I didn't doubt that they were concerned about the fate of it. And I was reflecting to Mal Brough last night towards the end of our time in government, and after the intervention had started, we had a dinner at the lodge, and there was Mal and myself and Sue Gordon, a wonderfully talented woman who led the intervention group, and Noel Pearson. And we talked about what you might call the nitty-gritty of the challenge, the terrible circumstances in which children weren't raised, they just existed in parts of the Northern Territory. And, you know, we didn't pretend that it was the only problem of child neglect or abuse, but it was just a discussion that I've never forgotten, because particularly Sue brought a hands-on understanding, and very, very successful, highly regarded Indigenous woman with a wonderfully successful family. And she had a wholly practical approach. She wasn't sort of neglectful of the rights equation, but she said, you know, you've got to give people a bit of hope for the future. Now, can I thank Paul Kelly, not here, but as always, he gives a wonderful overview. I'm of the view that in the years I've been in politics, the two great chroniclers of Australian politics have been Alan Reid and Paul Kelly. And they brought different talents of different eras, but they both have a capacity in language which we can understand and relate to, have a capacity to put politics of the individual era in perspective. And just as I will always remember those three wonderful books, The Power Struggle, the Whitlam Venture and the Gorton Experiment, so I remember, will remember the End of Certainty and the March of Patriots, and probably a number of others, but both of them have been wonderful chroniclers, I think, without peer of Australian politics. Can I say I think the presentations have been fair. I don't take violent exception to anything that's been said. It would be churlish of me to do so. We live in an era where free expression should be the order of the day, and every government has to be subjected to scrutiny. And my government had plenty of failures. I think we had a number of major successes, but I think one of the strengths we had was stability. And the only time since Federation you've had three people occupying the Prime Ministership, the Treasury and the Department of Foreign Affairs for the whole time. And I think it's also important to make the point that it went beyond those three positions. And the relations between the Liberal Party and the National Party were fundamental to the success of the government, and they'll always be, and it's a view I expressed yesterday. And I think the capacity of so many of the senior figures in the government to go out and argue the case in the media, very important. I think, if I may say so, it was a disappointment to me that there wasn't a full frontal from all the ministers in the just defeated coalition government. I think far too much fell to a small number of people, and I felt on occasions that the only three people who were speaking for the government were the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and the Defence Minister. And although I do say that in his own area, Greg Hunt did an excellent job. Of course, I had a lot of ministers who were very keen to do the media. I have to say they were all, they were all very keen, but one I've always, Alexander Dowden was a wonderful, enthusiastic media performer. I remember on several occasions he would do an interview and do a news conference on some foreign policy issue, and I'd be doing a news conference on something else, and I would get a question about foreign affairs, and then he'd complain to me later that night. He said, "You knocked me off the 7 o'clock news tonight," he said, and he said, "They'll always run you instead of me." But it was a metaphor for his enthusiasm, and you can't overestimate the importance of continuous communication. And if I can refer to David's paper this morning, one of the things that I've reflected on is that, I look back over past and present and Prime Ministers, that Menzies was outstanding as a communicator in the forms that really mattered then. I mean, he's the greatest political orator by far I've ever heard. I mean, he was just superb. But he was, how do we remember Menzies from great public meetings? Somebody saying, "I wouldn't vote for you if you were the Archangel Gabriel," which his reply famously was, "Madam, if I were the Archangel Gabriel, you wouldn't be in my constituency." Now, those sort of comments, and you associate them with a rowdy public hall. Now, that was it then. I thought Bob Hawke used television brilliantly. I thought he was very persuasive in that one-on-one interview style. Paul Keating was, of course, renowned for his bursts in Parliament. He would get rave reviews from the gallery. I'm not sure the public necessarily shared those reviews, but that's another matter, not an occasion to dilate on that. And I chose to emphasise, not to the exclusion of other media, the talkback radio, because it seemed to me to be the way to better communicate. Now, every Prime Minister will make a judgment about that, but I think David brought out very, very well that when you think back, that the different forms suited the era and suited the times. The relationship between the Prime Minister's office and the public service is fundamental to any successful government. You're not going to change the centrality of the PMO. You're not going back, of course, to the days that I know some public servants are wistful about, prior to 1972, when essentially the only people who worked in Prime Ministerial offices were public servants. The only people who gave policy advice. I've never forgotten a wonderful quote of the great John Bunting about how a really good senior private secretary, principal private secretary, was outstanding, arranging things like the Prime Minister's travel schedules. It's, beyond value. Now, those days have gone, but what days haven't gone is the need to have a respectful relationship between the Prime Minister's office and the public service. And my experience of problems we got into in government happened when there was a bit of a breakdown in the relationship between a minister's office and the public service. I think The children overboard affair, clearly part of the problem there. And I'm not apportioning blame, was a breakdown in the communication between the then Minister's Office and the Department of Defence. And the relationship that Arthur Sinodine has had with, firstly, Max Moore-Wilton, and then with Peter Shergold, and I certainly share Professor Walter's high opinion of Peter Shergold as an advisor. He was an outstanding policy enthusiast. I've not forgotten one occasion we were travelling overseas and I wandered back to where he and several other people were sitting and started the chat, and he said, I said, "What are you reading, Peter?" And he said, "Oh, I'm reading this study about the reaction of native-born Englishmen to the welfare benefits given to recently arrived Bangladeshis." And I said, "Well, gee, that's..." And he said, "Oh, it's all relevant to the welfare review that you're having." And of course it was. But that's the example that just stuck in my mind of this man's eye for policy detail. But Arthur, having been a public servant himself, but a public servant who was an extremely good economist, but developed an absolute love of politics. He really took to politics in a big way. And he was able to work very closely, and that's so important. You've got to respect the public service. You've got to listen to their advice. You don't always take it, and you shouldn't, because sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're right, but you've got the responsibility. But if you're not going to take their advice, you've got to tell them why. And there's nothing more demoralising than to do papers and send them over to ministers and hear nothing month after month. That is demoralising, and it's something that I try to the best of my ability to drill it into people. Can I say something about inquiries? I thought Scott Prasser's paper was fascinating in highlighting the different forms of inquiries. There are ones that you come into office with an intention of doing. And I suppose the one that stands out in my mind as having been the most comprehensively successful policy inquiry of all time was the Campbell inquiry. Now, the Campbell inquiry was in fact the brainchild of Malcolm Fraser, or perhaps his economic advisor, Professor John Rose, who was his economic advisor at the same time as then a very young Professor John Hewson was the economic advisor to Philip Lynch. And Malcolm Fraser went to the 1977 election with a promise to establish an inquiry into capital markets. Now that morphed fairly quickly after we won the 77 election into an inquiry into the financial system. Now initially, of course, that inquiry was, its main recommendations were totally opposed by the Labor Party, because they weren't the least bit interested in deregulation. And there were many people in the coalition who didn't believe in deregulation either, because they believed that we had been successful through the Menzies years by controlling everything. And essentially, economic policy then was bipartisan. Everybody believed in a fixed exchange rate, everybody believed in high tariffs, everybody believed in centralised wage fixing, and nobody thought you should sell government enterprises. They were returning dividends to governments. And of course, this was the era when a Victorian Liberal government felt emboldened enough to reject a takeover bid for Ansett Airlines. Why? Because it would fall out of Victorian hands. But that, of course, is another matter. But that inquiry ended up being implemented by a Labor government, to its credit, with the support of the opposition. And I think it was quite remarkable. But one of the reasons it was successful was that it had very good people on it. Keith Campbell, Alan Coates, who used to run the AMP, Keith Halkerston, who was a great and respected person in the financial community. I remember having an argument with the late Max Walsh, the editor of the Financial Review, and who did more, I think, as a journalist to inculcate in the political class the importance of economics to politics, he said you should have a Ben Chifley on it. And he was referring to the fact that when Casey in the 1930s had an inquiry into the banking system, he put Ben Chifley on it. And I argued back, I said, no, I said I wanted to have a group of people on it who believed totally in what the objective of the inquiry was, and that was to free up the financial system. And of course, Chifley developed bad habits when he's on that inquiry, and led him to try and nationalise the private trading banks in the 1940s. But inquiries which are motivated entirely by partisan politics are to be condemned. Inquiries which respond to crises, difficulties, and I guess the AWB inquiry under Terry Cole, which we established and led to myself and a number of other ministers going into the witness box and giving evidence on oaths. That was because I felt there was a suspicion in the community that the government was covering up. We weren't. I wasn't aware of the activities of certain people associated with AWB, and I first was alerted to it in a chance meeting I had with Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, who had been appointed by the UN to have a look at the way in which sanctions had been avoided by the Iraqi government, and he gave me the distinct impression that there was something wrong in the behaviour of the AWB, and I suggested to Mark Brough we had to do something about it. I thought that Peter Jennings' assessment of the operation of the NSC was very fair, very accurate. I'm very proud of the NSC. I think it worked extremely well. It never leaked. And when you think that as well as having for all of that time the senior ministers, Prime Minister, Treasurer, Foreign Minister, Defence Minister, but also defence leaders of the calibre of Peter Cosgrove, public servants of the character of Rick Smith and Dennis Richardson, people who were outstanding advisors to both sides of politics. I mean, I often think of people saying, oh, we don't have any of those great public servants of the past who were able to advise both sides of politics. I often think of Dennis Richardson. Dennis Richardson was Bob Hawke's chief of staff when Hawke was defeated by Paul Keating for the leadership of the Labor Party and therefore the Prime Ministership. He would go on to become a Deputy Secretary of Immigration in my government, and then later as head of ASIO, and gave the most confidential advice imaginable to my government, and then as the ambassador to the United States appointed by my government, and later as Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and then I think being a glutton for punishment, he ended up being the Secretary of the Department of Defence. Now, that is a person who gave frank and fearless advice to both sides of politics, and as to what his own personal politics are, that's his business. But he was an example to me that was not only in the old days when he had people like that, in the not so old days we had a lot of them. But I thought the NSC worked well. I thought it held everybody together, and the capacity to have people of Richardson and Cosgrove's calibre in the room through all of the discussions. And I think in my time as Prime Minister, I would have only wanted a ministers-only discussion on 3 or 4 occasions. So everything effectively involving our decisions in relation to Timor, Iraq, Solomon Islands, Afghanistan, were made with the full participating benefit of the advice of those senior public servants. So can I just finish by saying that how indebted I am to all of the people who've contributed. It's very humbling to me that so many people of such calibre are willing to contribute their time and intellectual effort to a very effective retrospective. Now, all governments have got to be, as I say, have the yardstick run over them, and mine, of course, is no exception. And I think this is a very effective way of doing it, and I'm extremely indebted to the staff of the Howard Library and all of them. There's only a very small number of them. And I think it's important that we have a range of views. I think it's always important to have somebody in these gatherings who offer critical views of some of the received strengths of the Howard government in some controversial areas. I think it's very important that we have former senior Labor figures. We had Stephen Martin in the past. We've had Simon Cream and others who have made contributions. That is adding very much to the contest of ideas. We've just seen a change of government. It's only the 7th in Australia since World War II, and I reflected, and in fact I mentioned this in a letter I wrote to the new Prime Minister congratulating him that isn't it great this country has a seamless transfer of power, even in what is the great arsenal of democracy. The last transfer of power there on the most benign of interpretations was anything but seamless, and I think that's something we should therefore be particularly proud about in relation to Australian democracy. But thank you very much, Professor.